Welcome back to Book Talk. I just finished reading a novel called The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré. I decided halfway through reading it that I wasn't going to do a review because the middle was really slow and boring and I didn't think anyone would be interested. However, as usual, I kept reading and hell's bells does it get intriguing. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold follows a man named Alec Leamis who works as a British intelligence officer during the peak of the Cold War. No year is ever mentioned, but I did read online that it supposedly takes place a year after the construction of the Berlin Wall, which apparently only took a day in 1961. So it starts off at the border crossing from East Germany to West Germany. For those of you who don't know much about the Cold War, East was bad, West was good. Anyway, Leamis had been running a special intelligence ring within East Berlin to try and get information on a man called Hans-Dieter Mundt, a counterintelligence officer for something called the Abteilung. I don't know if I'm saying that right. From the little research I've done, it seems like the Abteilung was a small part of something called the Stasi, which was some sort of secret police in East Germany. Despite Leamis having run this operation for years, he was unable to collect anything tangible on Mundt, and went back to England with his proverbial hat in hand. This Mundt guy seems to be the white whale for many British intelligence officers, so in a meeting with his boss, Leamis is asked if he'd like to do a special mission, one that's off the books. I give The Spy Who Came In From the Cold 3 stars, and that's me being generous. It was good, and it gave you a peek at what life was like in Europe during the Cold War, which is cool if you weren't alive during it. I could even forgive the boring parts, but the reason it got a 3 and not a 4 or 5 is because the end started building up to something. Like, I was on the edge of my friggin' seat. You think it's leading up to this amazing, or at least satisfying ending, then you turn the last page and you're like, what the hell? This is the ending? I mean, I guess it's apropos to the depressing nature of the Cold War, but come on. You couldn't have thrown poor Alec a bone? So as I said, the book starts off at the border between East and West Berlin. It's late at night, and Alec Leamis has already crossed over to the west, but has been waiting all day for a man named Carré, his only surviving undercover source and a member of the Presidium of the Socialist Unity Party. Carl finally arrives at the crossing. Everything seems to be going smoothly, but before he even reaches the west side, he's gunned down by an East German sentry. And Leamis left Berlin as he had come, without a single agent in his network. He goes to headquarters in London, an anonymous government building in Cambridge Circus, and takes a meeting with his boss, a man simply referred to as Control. They have a quick discussion about Carl and all the other agents they lost in Berlin. Then, Control says he needs Leamis to stay out in the cold a little longer. I'm not sure if this is a real term used by secret agents, out in the cold, in from the cold, but I do feel like mentioning that the author, John le Carré, actually worked for MI5 and MI6 during the 50s and 60s, so it's entirely possible. And if anyone's qualified to write a book like this, it's him. Anyway, Control wants to get rid of Hans-Dieter Mundt once and for all. They haven't been able to do it through official channels, so he needs Leamis to get in deep by framing himself as a double agent, or at least a traitor. Leamis agrees, and they start setting the stage for his decline within the organization. It starts with Leamis being demoted to the financial department, as he calls it, being put on the shelf, and losing his pension because of it. He begins to show signs of alcoholism, and is eventually dismissed for apparent fraudulent activity with the accounts. I really liked the way Le Carré wrote this chapter. He writes about how Leamis was perceived by his co-workers during this time. The pity, the rumors. It makes you think he's really on a downward spiral, because we don't actually find out about the double agent thing until much later, when he's first approached by someone in the party. So, Leamis kept up appearances after he was supposedly fired. He got a new dingy apartment with cheap rent, found some odd jobs that never worked out, and spent every penny he earned on booze. In pubs so people could see him, of course. Then, through the labor exchange, he was given a job in a rundown library where he meets a young Jewish woman named Liz Gold, who he later finds out is a communist. The two eventually become lovers. Liz fell in love with Leamis, and I actually think he loved her too, but was too afraid or too proud to say it. He was in his 50s and divorced. I don't know. I'm not a man, so I don't really know. how you guys think, but I'd like to think that deep down, Lemus was afraid to say I love you after the huge cock-up he made of his marriage. So one day, Lemus goes to a store near his apartment, gets into an argument with a grocer, and then hits him twice. The first hit fractures the man's cheekbone, and the second one dislocates his jaw. Lemus is put on trial and sent to prison. When he's released 3 months later, Lemus is immediately approached by a man who claimed his name was Ash with an E. He takes him to lunch and tells him this convoluted story about how they had met at a party in Berlin, which obviously wasn't true. But he says that he owes Lemus some money from back then and wants to pay him back. He writes a check that Lemus awkwardly admits he can't cash because he doesn't have a bank account, so they agree to meet the next day. When the men part ways, Lemus makes his way to a meeting with Control at the home of a retired agent named George Smiley, taking extra care to make sure he wasn't being followed. They talk a little bit about what happened, but primarily they talk about Liz and how Lemus doesn't want her involved in this in any way. He makes it very clear that he doesn't want them to give her money or do anything that would make the enemy suspicious. The next day, Ash invites Lemus to stay at his home, before introducing him to an associate of his named Sam Keever. He claims to have a journalistic proposition for Lemus because he obviously can't just come out and say what they're really talking about. He says he runs an agency with international clients that would pay top dollar to ask questions. Everything seemed very rushed to Lemus, and next thing he knew, he was on a plane to the Netherlands with a forged passport. Once there, an Abteilung agent named Peters interrogates Lemus for 3 days at a safe house. This was one of the boring parts that I talked about earlier. At least I thought it was boring. Lemus was mostly asked questions about what happened when he was in Berlin, to which he admitted that they didn't have much luck getting anything on the Abteilung until Karl Ramick joined them. Peters immediately noted that a low-level player like Ramick wouldn't know half the stuff he did and had to have been working with someone higher up. And over the next 2 days, everything Lemus said seemed to confirm that, like the deposits he made to 2 banks in Copenhagen and Helsinki under different aliases that were supposed to be payments for an undercover agent. What was cool about the interrogation was the fact that Lemus, despite playing the role of a traitor, still had to make sure to lie about some things and be vague about others, because he says even a willing traitor has doubts about betraying their country, their home, and unconsciously omit parts of the story. It wasn't all that hard for Lemus, though. Even though he was doing it for the sake of his country, he still had a sick feeling in his stomach. On the 3rd day, Peters comes to Lemus and tells him that he's a wanted man in England, supposedly for failing to report to a police station within the statutory period after release, but rumor had it he was wanted for an offense under the Official Secrets Act. His picture was in all the London evening papers with very vague captions. Peters says that every country in Western Europe would be looking for him, so the Abteilung had arranged safe passage for him to the east if he'd like. Lemus doesn't know if Peters is telling the truth or not, but either way, if he doesn't go with him, he'd be ruining the operation. They race to the airport to catch a plane to Berlin. While Peters was at the passport desk, Lemus found a kiosk with English newspapers and discreetly buys one. He found a picture of himself just like Peters said, and for the first time since the operation started, Lemus was scared. This had been Control's doing, and it was never a part of the deal. He had no choice but to go along with the Abteilung, but what was to stop them from ever letting him go? And there was no good reason a wanted man would want to be let go. While this is happening, back in Britain, Liz is visited by 2 men who ask her a lot of questions about Alec Lemus, including what their relationship was like. Now, when I was first reading this, I thought these men were with the Abteilung, which stopped making sense when they said they'd make sure she was looked after money-wise, and even paid the outstanding debt on Alec's flat. One of the men hands Liz his card, which shows his name is George Smiley. You remember the retired agent whose house Lemus went to meet with Control? Yeah, it was him. I was a little scared for Lemus at this point. Even after he specifically told them not to involve Liz, they still did. So what else were they going to do? Once in East Germany, Lemus is introduced to a man named Fiedler, which was somewhat expected once the seed was planted. Control said Fiedler was the only man who was a match for Munt, and on the plus side, he hated his guts because Fiedler was a Jew and Munt hated Jews. This was another boring part. It took me a few days, weeks, to get through. It was really just Fiedler interrogating Lemus some more about the same things as Peters, but in more depth. The deposits Lemus made to the banks in Copenhagen and Helsinki just so happened to coincide with 2 trips Munt had taken to both places on supposed abdeling business. But he also tells Lemus about himself and Munt, and they speculate on when Munt could have possibly become an informant for the circus or whatever. The details aren't really that important, but just know there's enough circumstantial evidence against Munt to raise more than a few questions. One night near the end of Fiedler's interrogations, Fiedler and Lemus are abruptly arrested by Munt's men. Lemus killed one of the guards in the panic. He didn't know who they were or what they were going to do to him, so he did the only thing he could and defended himself. They knocked him out, and when he came to, Lemus was in some sort of cell. They had beaten him to a pulp while he was unconscious. Munt tried to do his own interrogation of Lemus, but he was in a bad way from the beating and lost consciousness again, before waking up in a hospital bed. Fiedler is there and reveals that on the same day they were arrested, he submitted his own request with the Presidium for a civil warrant to arrest Munt as an enemy of the people. So they intervened and released Lemus and Fiedler from Munt's custody and brought them all in to present their cases in a tribunal. Fiedler goes first. In 1956, Munt had gone to London with the East German Steel Mission. While he was there, he became a wanted man and had to go into hiding. 2 days after his warrant was issued, he walked into the London airport and flew to Berlin. Fiedler says this wouldn't have been possible to do, since his photo and description had been spread throughout the British Isles, unless, of course, he was working with them. He thinks that Munt was brought into custody and made a deal with the British. He would give them information and they would pay a lot of money for it. It was even speculated that they helped him rise through the ranks so they could get better info off of him. His arguments were very convincing. Then he brought Lemus to the stand and asked him about the bank deposits and his time in Berlin. And then he suggested that Karl Ramick had been sent to Lemus by Munt as a way to give information without getting caught, which was why Karl got shot by the men on the east side. 2 can only keep a secret if one of them is dead, right? So then the cross-examination happens. Munt's representation says that Lemus is lying, and this whole thing was a ploy by the British government to get rid of Munt. Then he starts asking Lemus questions, asking about George Smiley, if Lemus had seen him since getting out of prison, and if he didn't see them, then why was he at his house in Chelsea? He couldn't have known about that. Lemus had been especially careful making sure no one followed him. He finishes his line of questioning, and who should show up as a witness but a confused Liz Gold. While Lemus was away, she had received an invitation to participate in an exchange of party members with the Socialist Unity Party and found herself in East Germany at the exact same time as Lemus. This poor girl. She doesn't know what's going on and she's afraid of saying the wrong thing, but she doesn't know what else to say. The man asks her a lot of questions, which lead up to her admitting that the lease on her flat was paid by some sort of charity. She didn't ask any questions because she guessed it was from Lemus or one of his friends. Then he asks about the 2 men that showed up just after Lemus had been sent to prison, which is something else he shouldn't have known. It's during the course of questioning that Lemus realizes this whole thing was a setup from the get-go. Munt's lawyer, or whatever he was, knew so many things he shouldn't have, including the rumor about him stealing money from the circus, a rumor that was designed for internal consumption only. The operation wasn't to get rid of Munt. It was to get rid of Fiedler, who was so close to exposing Munt as a double agent he was. Blew my friggin' mind. That's not at all what I thought would happen. So it ends with Munt allowing Lemus to escape, which was a part of the plan the whole time, and he reluctantly did the same with Liz. He knew she was Jewish, and told Lemus he was a fool for taking her with him. Dude's just so hateable, but I guess it's a hate the sin, love the sinner kind of thing. The 2 of them head for the Berlin Wall. There's a specific place they have to be at a specific time in order to get across. The barbed wire at the top of this section had been cut to make it easier to cross, and George Smiley would be on the other side waiting. But as they're climbing, something happens that no one expected, least of all me. Lemus got to the top of the wall and reached down to pull Liz up. 90 seconds had not passed, but he was suddenly blinded by the spotlight. He kept pulling her up until the shots rang out and she slipped out of his grasp. Lemus can hear someone on the western side telling him to jump, and George Smiley asking where the girl is. He looks down and sees Liz dead at the foot of the wall. She was 22 years old. Lemus hesitates for a moment, then climbs back down to be with her. The Eastern soldiers hesitated, as if this wasn't supposed to happen. Someone shouts an order and still no one shoots. Until they finally did. That's how it ends, folks. You know, up until that last page, I honestly thought everything was going to work out. I thought it would end with them safely on the western side, especially considering the last chapter is called In From the Cold. Call me crazy, but I don't think dying horribly next to a woman you were too afraid to admit you loved can be considered as coming in from the cold. Greatest spy story ever, my ass. Let me know what you think, though. Would you give this book more than 3 stars or less? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. And I'll be reviewing a post-apocalyptic novel about a man and his son, right here on Book Talk.